I want to talk briefly about the origins of translation studies as an academic discipline. That's what I think that phrase means. Translation studies names an academic discipline. And I'm doing so in 2022, actually on the last day of 2022, because it marks out 50 years from 1972 and James Holmes's paper on the name and nature of translation studies, which is a point of reference, an obvious point of reference. And we can look at 50 years since then. However, that is no more than one point of reference. I remember in an interview I did with Gideon Toury, I started out saying, "Oh, you are the founder of a kind of translation studies." And he replied vociferously with some irritation, "Nobody's a founder of anything. There is no one point of departure. Everything comes from previous work." There is, it's an absurd essentialism to suggest, 1972, James Holmes, translation studies, that's where it began. It wasn't like that. It isn't like that, particularly given that that is Western translation studies. If you go into Wikipedia, you will find in the English version of translation studies, an alternative point of departure is mentioned. Let's see if we can find that. Here we are, 1958, Fourth Congress of Slavists in Moscow. And we've got the linguists against the literary scholars and having this debate. And somebody says, apparently, this is from Moulin, a report. No, it's not Moulin, it's Carré, Edmond Carré. Gives the report, why don't we get the two to work together? Okay, and that could be a beginning for translation studies, well before James Holmes, who is, of course, mentioned later on there, and Eugene Nida, etc. But it's not in the West. There were other things happening prior to any foundational or apparently foundational declaration in the West. Wikipedia is interesting. You go into the other languages and each language finds an origin in its own linguistic field. Okay, so there are many possible origins, and why not? Everybody's free to do what they want there. A really interesting origin is here. This is 2000 and something, 21, Venuti's Translation Studies Reader, where we find, it says translation studies, right? So it's talking about an academic discipline. Foundational statements were in Chinese with the discussion of the translation of Buddhist sutras. So, hey, you know what? It started in China. I don't know. What is it? Okay. What you're doing here is when you construct this foundational myth, a myth in every sense of the word, you're setting up the kind of institution that you want to work in, that you're developing. So it's actually not a historical act of identifying something there. It's positioning yourself. And Venuti, this is a wonderful marketing move. You know what? Translation studies started in China. Well, no, it didn't. And Venuti doesn't say that in his accompanying text. Because there are these kinds of translators discussing the principles of translation all over the place. It depends on whether or not you want to say that is translation studies, or translation studies is when the thing becomes an academic discipline and institutionalized as such. Now, I have nothing against anybody doing that. Somebody in Slovakia wants to be developing on, I inherit the work of the Nitra school, and so I'll continue in that way. Why not? You can do that. Cognitive translation studies will have its own origins. Semiotics will find another kind of origins. Functionalism, which is a word taken on by the Skopos people in Germany, will have another foundation myth. Now, there's nothing wrong with that plurality, and there is no reason to privilege 1972 James Holmes, except that it was an explicit move to set up a coordinated research program in an institution, and it talks about different disciplines that existed at the time, and talks about naming an academic discipline. Okay, all of those will too, of course, and I have nothing against that plurality. Now, what am I going to do here is look at what's called a critical review of the narrative of Western translation studies, a foundational mythistorical discourse by Brian Baer, who is an excellent researcher. I draw on very much for anything concerning Russian translation studies, and he's an excellent mind and an excellent critic, except I think in parts of this particular paper, which is what I'm going to work on. Now, Brian sets up an analysis that observes the birth of something of Western translation studies post-war. Holmes makes a passing comment saying that it developed from after the Second World War, the aftermath of the Second World War. So that's enough for Baer to pick that up and put it in there. It's associated with the imperial myth of the West dominating, assuming hegemony over the rest of the world. And it has a foundational developmental trajectory, that this progress, that with this Western hegemony, things are going to get better. And so we have views of translation studies getting better, for example, since the Second World War, or since 1972. And that coincides, obviously, in history with neo-colonial geopolitics, where Western scholarship, Western institutions progressively dominate the world, setting up colonial type relationships. Why is that bad? Because we have delegitimization, or in fact ignorance, of knowledge from elsewhere in the world. And Baer points to the global South, and at some point he's talking about the West in capital letters, and then the global North, which dominates the global South and doesn't recognize what is done in the South as being legitimate knowledge. So it's a very, very powerful critique of precisely the kinds of origin myths that I've just been talking about. Okay, now I'm interested in the evidence that's mustered in order to develop that. And Brian what's the way out? It's to open up translation studies to a more heterogeneous field of input from different parts of the world and different kinds of ideas. I agree very much, needless to say, with the solutions. I don't agree with the analysis of the problem, as we will see in a minute. Okay. Now, how do we know this? It's because the development of translation studies coincides with this development of capitalism, as you can see, of global capitalism. To coincide with something isn't a causation. You know, we could say the same thing here about what? About artificial intelligence, for example, coincides with, okay, developed from the Second World War. Anything you like there, postmodern architecture coincides with, anything could coincide with and be tarred with the same brush. That is, that we are involved in this capitalist project to dominate the world. The hegemonic spread of Western values and languages at the expense of minor ones, that is, translation studies in the Western narrative, is involved in this process, says Brian. And the promotion of transposability or glossodiversity over translatability, or semiodiversity, question mark. That is, has translation studies been involved in promoting translatability over diversity? Okay, has translation studies been helping diversity or not, basically? Now, that's a good question to ask. How could you answer it? I don't know. When I go back to those guys there who were setting up translation studies. That's James Holmes in the front, and that's Evan Zohar, and José Lambert, and Henri Lefebvre, and Gideon Toury. All right, couple of things. They weren't really aware that they were participating in this massive globalist project. James Holmes was from the United States. He was American, but he was living in Amsterdam, and he was setting up Dutch gay studies at the time. He's hardly a representative of this US-led capitalist order. And those people, along with the people from what was then Czechoslovakia, Popovich, Miko, for example, Levy, those people were from Europe's and the Middle East for Israel, smaller cultures. And they were there representing those smaller literatures, their literary scholars, okay? Very much in favor of semiodiversity, of manifesting the cause of the smaller languages and literatures, the ones that translate the most for statistical reasons that I'm not going to go into here. So to sort of put up this charge sheet of things that we are guilty of because we coincided with them, and then to look at the actual people there who are having fun, discussing their literatures and talking about changing the way that literatures can be studied to increase the diversity and to enhance the presence of the minor cultures through translation. It's just a massive contradiction, and one really wonders whether coincides with is enough as evidence. Now, why does this interest me? Because I'm a baddie too. I'm involved in this capitalist plot to overcome over the instill hegemony over the entire world. All right, what have I done that's so bad? Translation studies started to take shape as an academic discipline. That history is extremely important, right? I wrote that. It's in inverted commas. You see that? And that's in the first edition of the book, Exploring Translation Studies. And this is Baer, all right? The importance that Pym, the then president of the European Society of Translators, which is not technically true because I wrote that in 2009, but anyway, the importance that Pym ascribes to that history, because I do say it's extremely important, yeah, is linked to his deep investment in the consolidation of translation studies as an independent discipline. The value of Pym's iteration of the originary myth, so I've done exactly the same as all the other people of the field, while no less Eurocentric than the others, because I refer to those scholars you just saw, actually, and perhaps in some ways more so, yeah, because I was president of the European Society, lies in the fact that it's easily quantifiable. There are some numbers, and that's even worse. Why is it worse? Well, let's go on. This is Baer again. Pym's idea that we cannot have a field of study without autonomous departments. That means we need separate university departments for translation studies, says Pym, apparently. Is no less of an interpretive position. Good. It's quantifiable. One can count the number of translation studies departments in existence. Yes, and I have actually done that. Why have I done that? Well, we're not told. Where have I done that? No, there's no reference here. The reference was to the book on translation theories. That book does not have any numbers in it like this. Is there any evidence that the research conducted on translation and interpreting related phenomena outside autonomous departments of translation studies is somehow of less value than the research produced within those departments? And there Brian talks about the many great scholars who have worked in departments of modern languages, of literature, comparative literature, etc., with great justification. Pym's choice of departments of translation studies as his measure of what? I don't know. Of measure of success? I don't know. However, conveniently reinforces Western Europe's leading position in the field. Ah, okay. That's why it's bad to be empirical and count numbers, because Western Europe apparently comes out as the winner. What, against the United States? Oh, Brian, oh, you're not leading us? Oh, dear me, poor Americans. Now, all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is pure bullshit. I will now show why. What did Pym actually say? Now, this is the passage in that book that this was taken from. And here's what's cited, okay? Pym actually said, translation studies started to take shape as an academic discipline. Yeah, that history is important. Yeah, and that's the citation bit, done from this guy who has a degree, a doctorate in literature from Yale. You'd expect some minimum level of scholarship. However, here's what that passage says. The paradigm can be traced back to the Russian formalists. Ah, what? What? Western translation studies can go back to the Russian formalists? And I would go even further. I think that the application of science to cultural phenomenon, you can go back into French aesthetics of Impressionism and Symbolism and find that impact there, leading through to the Russian formalists. So I'm not even going to stop there. It all goes back in history. Come on. We know this. Okay, and then the idea connects with translation theorists going through Prague and Bratislava and Leipzig, and then Tel Aviv with Evan Zohar and Turi, and then the Netherlands and Flanders. Okay, so all these smaller cultures picking up on the ideas that were in Russian and developing them, and then meeting. That's why they were having fun in that photo, meeting together and discussing. And that's where they started to get the idea that translation studies could or should be an academic discipline. Right? Nothing. There's no foundation myth there. Quite the opposite. And then why is it important? Because it did not come from the same roots as the others mentioned in this book. And that book has 7 or 8 chapters, I can't remember, but it talks about many different kinds of translation theory. And I'm pointing out that this particular one was the one that set up the idea of translation studies as a discipline. One among many, and that's why it's important, because there was a greater diversity. To lift that phrase out of that paragraph is to misrepresent it and misinterpret it entirely. Am I getting angry? Yes. Why am I getting angry? Because my position published was precisely the opposite of what is attributed to me. I have long argued that translation studies should learn to be homeless. I've argued that the independent departments of translation studies have been negative historically and negative intellectually. And there's a particular article there that argues it. Oh, I'm sorry, Brian, you didn't see it because it was published in Brazil in the South. Oh, dear me. I'm not going to argue that an Australian is representing the South. I'm not going to go that far. However, okay. Translation study should be done with considerable indifference to the politician academics who seek to build us towers or have discovered routes to scholarly paradise. I'm arguing exactly the same thing as Brian Baer. If there's any doubt about it, I've also argued that the Holmes map as drawn by Turi later on, lost the plot. It went wrong. It's been historically negative for translation studies because we separated from modern language departments and the teaching of languages. And I think that's entirely negative for us and equally negative for those departments of language teaching. And that you can follow there. You may or may not agree with the argument, but you cannot say that I was arguing that translation studies needs independent departments, because I've argued exactly the opposite. And in the YouTube video, but I don't expect anybody to watch YouTube videos, I actually take to task Mary Still Hornby, who got up and said in 1992, we need independent departments. I argued exactly the opposite. As for being president of the European Society, that was problematic for me. However, I did write an article, Translation Studies in Europe, Reasons for it. And I said, right, here we are in Europe. Let's look at translation here as a specific problem of Europe, provincializing Europe. It says there can be no suggestion that whatever we do in Europe is going to be immediately beneficial or transportable to any other part of the globe. We cannot argue that we lead the way in anything. Exactly the opposite of the position that has been attributed to me in this critical article. As for translator training, being European, okay, I have written and I have counted the training institutions, okay? And we can see when European institutions developed and when non-European institutions developed, all right? And here we go. Non-European training has been in quite different political and cultural contexts, giving rise to a surprising diversity of models and ideas. Exactly the diversity that Brian Baer is looking for, I was finding in these numbers, in the bloody evidence. If you get some evidence, you can look at it and find out about what was going on and look for the discourses attached to the numbers. Okay. Translator trainers could do well to consider this diversity of models, looking beyond those that have been developed specifically for Western European conditions. One of the articles I wrote this year was looking at Australian Aboriginal culture and looking for the translation solutions developed in those cultures. If you want to go south, go all the way and get some evidence, but don't just sit there and opine about some coincidence of a few phrases that you've selected, cherry-picked out, and attached to your narrative of global capitalism. As for the numbers, but please, I do go back and get numbers. You know why? Because I like to be able to point to things having happened in history. Here's the numbers for Western Europe's creation of translator training institutions. What you can see is that in 1970, 1980, and then afterwards, that there was more done in non-Western Europe, and you have the growth of non-industrialized countries. And after that point, China comes in with 10 MTI programs a year, and China just takes over the quantitative analysis in a huge way, and other parts, and Iran as well. Okay. Now, is that a truth? No, it's just data that has to be interpreted. But at least when I do that work, when I go back and count, it doesn't prove that Europe leads the way. It does prove that something happened here in Europe and then happened in the rest of the world. I can go back and then with some precision look at the discourses and where they were produced and try to say why this was happening. Why, in terms of some kind of causation, rather than a very, very interested coincidence. What's wrong with the critical theory that I've been looking at and complaining about? Because causation is on the big things. We are guilt by association. My God, I was born male and white and in a rich country. Heaven forbid, I'm guilty of everything, okay? What Baer is actually complaining about is the university system, which had Islamic origins, was developed in the West, and has spread all over the world. And we are playing the games of the university system. That has its very, very bad points. It does exclude non-institutionalized knowledge, but we are doing a lot to bring in other resources, other kinds of knowledge into the university. I speak from experience in Australia with Aboriginal knowledge, for example. In this narrative that Baer sets up of the global north, you've just got rid of all those minor cultures. You've got rid of what was happening in Central and Eastern Europe, talking with those people in Israel and Flanders and and Belgium. You got rid of all those small narratives of the actual diversity within what is still the West. And you've imposed a bloody American vision, like we are all part of your opposition in the Cold War to the Soviet Union. Even more so in a lecture Brian Baer gave in Misano Adriatico, where, this is the real thing that's happening. So forget about you little guys. It really is the imposition of American hegemony on the rest of what is supposedly a homogeneous West. It ain't homogeneous, mate. And the global South here enters as zero. Baer's article mentions nothing from the South. He doesn't go looking for anything from the South. He makes the extremely valid point that the West, and Western Europe in this case as well, and Germany especially, blocked and was radically uninterested in all the tremendous work done in Russian and Ukrainian in the 20s and 30s in the Soviet Union. There he's exactly right. There I have tried to make amends with the invaluable help of Nune Ayvazyan in going back to those texts and trying to incorporate them into a better, more substantial kind of historical narrative. But as it is in this particular critical theory, the global South is really just an empty token. That's it. That's what I have to say about the origin of translation studies. I don't care, actually. I'm far more interested in where we're going forward. And as for the values that Brian Baer espouses in that article, I agree 100% with them. And I'm just appalled that I'm sort of put in with the group of baddies. I think he's a good scholar. He's a good, solid scholar. He's a nice man, charming, cuddly even. And I depend on him for that work in Russian. I think he might have just fallen in with a bad group of people, as Dame Edna Everidge would have said. So I continued to read the rest of his work with great interest and enthusiasm, but please spare us this kind of misguided criticism.